Hello, I'm Juliette Foster, and this is the European Magazine interview. Now, we're all familiar with the expression, time waits for no one, often used as a rallying cry to seize a moment before it slips away. We can only guess at the numbers of people who may or perhaps might not have acted on that advice. But what's beyond dispute is the enduring fascination that time and cosmic space continue to exert over scientists, philosophers, and academics alike. It was the American author Nathaniel Hawthorne who once wrote, "Time flies over us, but leaves its shadow behind." A reminder, perhaps, that time doesn't merely pass, but it accumulates, shaping the contours of life. Well, 2 centuries after Hawthorne's observation, the historian Penelope J. Corfield invites us to view time not simply as a sequence of events, but as a living, breathing continuum of history. Her ideas are brilliantly encapsulated in her latest book, Time Space, and I'm delighted to say that Penelope J. Corfield now joins me. It is very good to see you. How are you?
Bouncing along.
I should actually refer to you by your proper title, which is Professor. So, Professor Corfield, thank you for being here.
Oh,
Let's look at the...
Please call me Penny.
Okay, fine. So, Penny, let's start with the book itself and what it's about. You address that issue in the preface because you say, and I quote, the book is about how humans can best cope with the mighty power of time and its cosmic co-partner, space. Now, my question to you is, why do you think we struggle with these forces? Is it because of their scale or perhaps their unpredictability?
Really great question. And I think the answer is time is so huge, it is scale, it's so huge and abstract, it's quite difficult to think about in its totality. We certainly think about time sort of in the day-to-day moment of got to rush and do this or do that. But to think about it as a whole is very, very difficult. And one sign of that, quite interestingly, there are very few jokes about time. There are jokes about clocks and all sorts of aspects of time, but there are very few jokes about time itself. It's just too big to laugh at.
Do you think we have a subconscious fear of time precisely because we don't really understand it to a certain extent and it is beyond our control?
I wouldn't quite say fear, but there's certainly there's certainly an apprehension when people are invited to think about the whole massive scale of things. But I think that's because most of our daily life, we live in the here and now. We're hurrying through to get done with what we have to do. But humans as a species do think long, so we can project our minds forwards and backwards when we have to or want to. So
Let me
I
run with
think
that, but let me run with that word apprehension. Do you think it is apprehension that perhaps disconnects us from our sense of place in the wider continuum of time? In other words, history.
I hesitate about that actually, because quite a lot of people feel sort of disconnected from history, but a lot of people actually feel sort of in the eye of the storm and doing things. I think it partly depends on human temperaments, but and cultures. But in fact, we all live in history from day to day, and we're far more imbued with history than we ever think. And I really enjoy talking to people who say things like history is bunk or I don't care about anything from earlier times, and then asking them a few questions, I don't know, about their family or their football team or whatever, and they soon start waxing eloquent on this. So there's nobody's existing actually in the simple here and now without any thought of anything before or after. There is one theory that time is just fragmented moments, but if so, we would be in fragments and we wouldn't be able to speak consecutive prose as we're speaking now. We wouldn't be able to listen to consecutive music through time. So every way we're deeply entrenched in time. I suppose it just slightly startles people when they're asked to think about it, because it's just what we live. Time is what we live in, and it's in
Mm.
us.
It's interesting though because in the book you refer to history as a collective human journey, which makes sense. You've explained why, because we are all players in this thing called history, and yet there is a sense of detachment that we are minor actors in the drama or we have no involvement in it at all. Why does that detachment persist? And what would it take to actually change things, to change the perception, to make people realise that we are all players in this magnificent drama? We can determine the outcome.
That's really good question. But one answer is that actually, as you say, we're all in history, and even people who do nothing are actually having an effect by doing nothing. I mean, there's an old statement that bad men and women prosper because good men and women do nothing. So we all have to be active. And the people that stood by, say, in Germany with the rise of Hitler, they were in history, but just acquiescing in the things going on around them. So we're all in it, whether we're being pluses or minuses in the equation, as it were. And one way of studying the past is to get people to realize that.
So I guess that what you're referring to here is the idea of seeing ourselves as part of history in motion, regardless of where we are in the narrative thread. But what does that mean in reality for how we engage with society today and potentially in the future?
My answer to that is always people should be aware of being in history and part of history, and then do what they can, when they can, as they can. It's not right to set one standard, say, of civic engagement and expect everybody to be the same, because we're not. That's part of the point. So do what you can when you can is my motto.
What I found interesting when I was reading the book was how you use the example of elderly people and the difficulties that we have imagining them as young people and before that as children, because I guess that we see them as they are today, and it's very difficult to perceive that there is more to them, that things had to happen to get them to to the point of where they are now. And that was very powerful, because what you're telling us here is continuity. That's what we need to appreciate in the human experience, continuity. How do you think that sort of perspective can build empathy across the generations? Because there is an argument that perhaps empathy is missing and we need it more than ever.
Yes. Well, it is jolly useful to get people talking across the generations. Really, really very useful. And it's good for both the older people and the younger people. And it often happens, for example, at family parties. I'm a great one for having big family parties, not all the time, but enough for people to start talking. And one of my own I've always been interested in the long term. One of my own little games is to look at someone and try and imagine what they were like as a kid, or to look at a kid and try and imagine what they're going to be like when they're grown up. I mean, of course, you don't know for sure, but it just makes you think, they're not stuck in the age they are. And by the way, one of the other things I like to ask people is, what is your inner age? I mean, I can ask you, what is your inner age? But people start revealing what they think is their inner age. And I mean, my inner age is 25, although I am a little bit older than that. And it just gets people talking about how they feel about themselves. And quite often, a number of elderly people are going to say they feel 25, 30 or whatever. But a percentage, they'll say, oh, I feel 100, or,
Even though they're not 100.
Yes, even though but that's usually the sign of one who's unwell or, not enjoying life. But it's just quite interesting to make people realize. I think I've become more and more aware of this, as I have been 25 for many years now. I've become more and more aware, sort of my body, life around me is changing, but innerly I feel 25. That sort of the inner me is just persisting. But again, this is also interesting because in some forms of mental illness, people lose that sense of their inner self, and that's very hard to try and help them recover it.
I need to stress now that my inner self is slightly younger than yours. I'm 21.
Oh, oh, baby.
So exactly, a baby. A little bit of healthy competition going on there. But I mean, I find this really fascinating, because I guess that it really begs a much bigger question about how the difficulties we have in imagining each other across periods of time. Does that perhaps point to how narrowly we experience time ourselves, that somehow if we could reconcile the two things, that we might be onto a smoother path?
Well, we do all live in the here and now. That's an absolute definition of life, and we can't move outside our spot of time or space. But the human imagination and intellect can roam all over the place. So I think it's partly to do with education, and also talking, as we've just been saying, across the generations. That can help to break out of this. And the humans, as a species, we think long. We predict things well centuries ahead, and we look back through the eons of the past. So we have that capacity.
But I mean, earlier you were talking about this sense of immediacy. Certainly, it's one of these 21st century phenomena that you can click a button and something arrives at your house within half an hour of ordering it. And my point is that perhaps we have developed an obsession with speed and immediacy. My question to you is, do you think that that in itself has distorted the relationship that we have with time? And because we see things in a very short span, it makes it much difficult for us to actually understand and indeed grasp long-term consequences.
Yeah, now that really is interesting. And of course, the very recent digital era it is too recent for us to be fully aware of all the impacts. But I still think in the long run, yes, back in the long run, no, I still think though, no, because people, when detached from their social media, as it were, are still going to find all the old experiences happening short and long term all around them. And I actually do think there is a case, and there's going to be a case for proper regulation of the amount of time kids spend on their phones and other social media when very young. And so, but it's like all forms of new technology, there's always an impact on society, but society also has to find a way of coping with it. So we're in the here and now, but we think and are in the long term. Those propositions are never going to go away.
Mm. And we're trying to wrestle with them now. You rightly refer to legislation. The question is policing it and enforcing it, but that's a conversation for another day. What I'd like to go back to is this idea of space being a cosmic partner to time. And how do you see physical space actually shaping the historical consciousness? Another one of those deeper questions, particularly if people feel that they're somehow detached from history, that the real people who make the history are the people with the big names because they're the ones who are at the epicenter of events.
Yes, again, this is quite a searching point because we are all very influenced by our physical geography, just the terrain we live in and the sort of culture and economics of the society we live in, but also the traditions of that society. And so one of the things in education is it's very good to study comparative cultures, both now, today, around the world, and through time. And that's, in fact, I think history teaching and geography teaching are increasingly, or human geography, are increasingly adapting to do that. Because while we are in our own point of time and space, we're on one planet Earth, and we need to know about how all the other inhabitants of our home planet are living and experiencing things. So comparative studies are going to be the way forward.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say comparative studies are the way forward at a time when we're living in a world of borders and divisions, not just physical divisions, but also political divisions as well. Well, certainly the idea of borders has been politicised. But how do you think we can actually cultivate a sense of a shared spatial belonging that above all rises above nationalism?
Well, again, that's a good challenge. But as a historian, I would say that there are, over the last 300 years, 250 years, there are determined attempts to make that happening via all forms of international organizations. And I don't just mean official ones like, well, obviously in the last 80 years, the United Nations or international law or international law courts, but also there's a tremendous number of other organizations established by international treaty, each one like Interpol or the World Bank. There are thousands of those. And even more interestingly, there are over 55,000 non-governmental international organizations which are just set up all around the world with citizens from different countries participating. And one of the most famous examples, founded in 1863, is the Red Cross, or as it's now known, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, when groups from all over different countries, there's hardly a country now in the world that doesn't have a Red Cross headquarters. And these are ways of establishing a sort of global common citizenship. It is happening. I am an optimist about it. I think it is a long-term trend. But of course, I'm not denying that wars and scandals and horrors are continuing. But we're getting a hold on them. And I expect you've been protesting. I've been protesting about all sorts of international events, joining international protest petitions, funding this and that relief force. We're not just living inside our own little local communities. Some of us are, and some of us aren't. I shouldn't broaden that too much. But in the long term, we are developing a global citizenship.
Well, that's certainly talked about. That's one of the aspirations for the 21st century, the global citizen, citizen of the, well, resident of a country, but a citizen of nowhere, if that's how the phrase goes. But taking it back to the point that you raised about building organisations, etc., I hear what you're saying, but not just the current experience, but history past. Doesn't it show us that belonging is still up against the power of opportunism? And that is the problem, that however well-intentioned the idea of global citizenship is, with everybody working together, it is struggling to hold its ground against opportunism. And if opportunism is couched in the correct way, it doesn't seem as a cynical measure. It smacks of common sense to those who are looking at it from the point of view of the spinner, the person who's propagating a specific line.
Well, yes, I do agree there's a tremendous lot of countervailing forces, but I just think this trend is here. It's going to continue. There are some examples. For example, in the 1990s, the world united with the problems of the CCFs in sprays and things, and was producing a hole in the ozone layer. And the hole is still there, but it's closing every year, and it's predicted another 50 years. It's not now a danger to human life on Earth or other life, and it's predicted in 40, 50 years it will close entirely. So there are things we do act together, and I don't know any even the baddies, without going into current politics, but none of the baddies have actually started sort of spraying everyone and trying to open the hole. A whole lot of things are accepted, and it's a bit like building states. When states were first set up, or learning democracy, it's not an easy journey, because, as I frequently write, humans are a tricky species. We're intelligent, but we're complex. We're very, very complex. So we can create problems as well as answers. But we are, there's the balance between all those all the time, and the graph of change, isn't a single steady line onwards and upwards. It oscillates all over the place. So, and somewhere somebody does a tally of the amount of fighting in the world every year, and in fact it oscillates, but in the long run it's going down.
But it may not necessarily feel that way, of course, to those who are actually caught in the centre of it. But that is the experience of something, and obviously it means different things to different people. But the bottom line is, when we talk about humanity, perhaps we need to see it as a collective experience. Yes, it's a journey, but one that we all share. But what does, or indeed should, that journey look like if you're going to view it through the lens of deep time?
If you take very, very, very deep time, then we look like a tiny little species on a tiny little planet of a tiny little star in a tiny little corner of the cosmos.
Even if we don't see ourselves that way.
No, but closer to home, I think the human story is positively epic, in that, as I say, we have these assets, we have these problems, but we're collectively overcoming them. And I know we have caused problems to other species, but we're collectively working to save endangered species. We're not just a sort of thoughtless crew rampaging around the planet. And the more and more we're becoming aware, we are inhabitants of one planet. We're common earthlings on planet Earth. And one of the secrets, not very well concealed secrets, is that space travel is very physically upsetting. That's why you have to train and train for it. So we can't just jump into a fleet of space
spaceships, rockets.
Yes, spaceships, and jet off to another planet if we feel we've ruined this one. No, we're stuck on. No, we're not stuck. We're happily habituated to this one, so this is the one we have to work with, and we are.
Finding different ways through that, but the bottom line is that you're absolutely correct. The human story is epic. It will run and run for as long as we want it to, and yet we still feel, many of us, disconnected from history. That is the contradiction. So is it because of the way perhaps that we talk about history, the way that it is handed down from generations to generations, because it is told through a series of events, 1066 and all that, or heroes, rather than as systems and shared experiences, just connecting it to this sense of that epic journey and where humanity lies in the great stream of things? Are we missing a trick here?
Well, I do think actually that history teaching and human geography teaching is changing a lot for precisely those sort of reasons. There's much more emphasis on daily life and sort of sinking into the culture and past cultures, how people lived in a daily life, and also structures, though of course we don't call that to school, don't say now we're going to do some structural history, but an awareness. So I don't think it is taught now in just heroes and events, although having a coherent story is a good way of getting things over, especially for the young. So I'm not against stories, but they have to be complex and allowing for the divergences or the complexities of things. But complex isn't necessarily a criticism. In fact, if we were simpler, just a sort of monochrome species, we wouldn't be doing what we are doing.
But at the same time, the storytelling itself surely has to be handled in such a way that you don't lose the sense of the event, but also you make sure that it is an encompassing experience, that everybody realizes that something which happened 400 years before they were born didn't just happen in a singular microcosm, that everybody, right down to the person who sold bread on the street, was part of that story.
Yes. And in the same way, monuments to past events are really very important as helping people focus on and remember those things, but they also have to be done in an ecumenical way, not sort of, this is our triumph after beating the baddie X, and sort of...
Right, so celebratory, take out the celebration.
Because mutual suspicion and hostility, as well as mutual love and cooperation, hostility and rancor can be passed down the centuries easily, just in family stories or community stories. And in fact, one of the great worries about any live physical conflict, not only it's got to be resolved sooner or later, but these are creating hostilities that are going to last for centuries. Very hard to overcome.
We're certainly reaping the consequences of these now, these hostilities.
Absolutely.
When you take the sort of totality of the book, it also addresses the importance of imagination in historical thinking. Why do you think imagination is really important, particularly when you're dealing with abstract forces like time and space? Because again, time, very vast, space, there's a lot we don't know about it. So how does imagination help us to take out the apprehension, reconcile the two things, and to perhaps celebrate being part of this magnificent journey in the scale of human evolution?
Yes, I do think human imagination is one of our crucial qualities, alongside logic and reason and all the rest. And the ideal is to synthesize the whole lot. But human imagination is very good for thinking up alternatives and allowing us to travel outside our own spot. Historical fiction, space fiction, all the rest. These are imaginative ways of allowing us to sort of think about the wider dimensions of time and space without shedding our actual knowledge that we're here in our own particular moment. And all of this is incredibly valuable unless historical fiction is mistakenly taken for fact.
Well, that takes us into another area of conversation about what is truth and fiction and so on and so forth. But look, let's fall into that particular rabbit hole, because otherwise I guarantee we will be trapped. But let's look at digital, because we are living in the digital age, and it has been a colossal explosion. There is more to come further down the line with AI, etc. But how does that impact the way that we perceive historical time? Do you think it's changed it, or perhaps it hasn't impacted so far?
I actually think the whole experience of both being in the here and now and thinking long, being aware of our own growth and aging and others, being involved in those are really hard to lose no matter what. But I do think, as we said before, digital is going to need careful regulation, as all innovations do. And this is one of the things about historians being creative but tricky. We have to make sure they're not misused or don't have deleterious effects.
Yeah, and that leads on to my other point as well, because yes, digital is important. There's a big conversation about regulating it for the better and balancing that with the right to freedom of expression and free speech. But at the same time, can digital reconcile the tension that exists between personal memory and collective history?
Well, it can help in some ways, and especially recreations and representations of these things can be very, very, it's a way of getting to people and sparking their imaginations as well as their mental efforts. So yes, it can be very creative and helpful, but as I say, within a regulated framework. But that applies to every single innovation that we've ever invented.
Just reading the book, I mean, I was a little bit intimidated because I thought, do I need to be an astrophysicist or something to understand this, or perhaps be familiar with the laws of relativity? I am neither, I hasten to add, but the book was highly readable and very, very thought-provoking, because it also revealed that the ideas around time and space, they are not just theoretical. We live them because they shape our views about life, how we grieve, for example, and indeed how we imagine our future if we're brave enough to take that to run with the ball. But looking at the concept of grief, what role do you think it plays in that sense of historical awareness? And I mean, I was talking about connecting the generations, okay, the present generation connecting with the generation of the past, but is mourning part of that connectivity with people with the historical past?
Absolutely. It's an excellent example of that, because the grief you feel is absolutely here and now, but it's referring to something that has happened, that you're aware that's happened, and his meaning is still alive for you. And sometimes people can grieve for really, really long times, and also communities can grieve for things that have happened, or indeed feel hostility, as we were saying earlier. So yes, many things actually in our lives are outside the immediate moment, but at the same time we can't get outside the immediate moment. So we've got to reconcile these two things, which I think is part of the fun of being a human. But no, I am a chronic optimist, as you've probably picked up.
But it's also part of the fun of actually looking at history to understand why people behave in a certain way. If you can actually dig around in that past to see how it's been handed down from one generation to the next, and so on and so forth, and perhaps weaves itself into a culture, into systems. But when that happens, I mean, in terms of interpreting things, history is important in that interpretation, interpreting the past. How does that sense of interpretation perhaps shape our civic identity?
It does very, very greatly. And that's why there have been some very interesting studies of how communities get to grips with, say, awful things in their past. And one of the societies considered most exemplary in doing this is modern Germany, post-Hitler, how they've come to terms with not just forgetting it, because that would be easy but wrong, but
Something you
actually,
can't forget.
yes, and actually not only being come from the top with civic leaders, religious leaders, politicians and so forth, but also in schools, in families and communities. And to recognise, yes, it did happen, and they don't go so much into why, but somehow we let it happen, or between us it happened, but we know why it's wrong, so that there's a sense of we have moved on. I know there are still debates in Germany over that, but that is considered absolutely exemplary, because how we view the past does affect. And actually, again, the civil wars are very, very difficult things to come to terms with. And some countries that haven't tried to come to terms with civil war, they're now saying, oh, we must talk about it, we must come to terms with it so we all know what happened. And so Spain, for example, is now beginning to talk about its civil war from the 1930s, which was just quietly sort of brushed under the carpet. And another society where I actually have some friends, activists, who are in the peace movement in Northern Ireland when religious disputes. And again, they're not trying to tell people dreadful things didn't happen and brush them out, or indeed, praise murderers or whatever, but they're trying to get communities, especially they're working with kids, getting kids to play and talk and play together, and they suddenly realize, oh, they're not the demons I was told they are, they're just ordinary humans like us, and they play together. Anyway, so I think it is very important acknowledging the past, and good things from the past as well, but also awful things, coming to terms with them, finding ways of processing, not just brushing them under the carpet. And interestingly, that's pretty like human individual psychology too. If somebody is trying to get to grips with a trauma, they're usually pressed to talk about it and at least sort of let it out and recognize it, rather than just simply ignore it and be silent. So history is a living tradition, and we have to live with it and work with it and make sure it's as beneficial a tradition as possible. And I'm not saying all traditions are bad. For example, British solidarity in wartime is very, very impressive and useful.
But clearly what you're saying here is that if you go into the past, yes, it can be a very difficult journey, but you come out of it a stronger individual. So that's as true for community as it is for individuals. But within that answer that you gave just now, you mentioned activism, and I want to go on to that because I want to look at historical awareness as a form of activism. Can it achieve that, and what type of activism should it inspire? Is there an ideal that we should be aiming for here, or is it whatever comes out, that's what you run with?
Well, I'll move on to the ideal in a moment, but the practical thing to note, it takes a lot of patience, a lot of time and patience to overcome deep hatreds, embedded rivalries, embedded competitions, and so forth. So it takes a lot of time, and usually the best way to start is with children, who they may have picked up these things, but once they start playing with other children, they can usually adapt. If
they challenge what they're taught.
Yes, if the helpers are kind and patient and so forth. But the ideal is not just, it is universal tolerance and getting on and so forth, but it's not quite forgetting and failing to judge crimes against humanity. So it has a judgmental side as well, and that needs to be confronted. It doesn't mean that everybody should be punished, as it were, but it means that it's not just done by condoning past things. So it comes with judgment as well. So it's judgment and it's like, for example, we say we are ecumenical, we tolerate all the cultures in the world, or we try to, but actually, I mean, there isn't a live one now, but if we came across a culture of cannibalism, we wouldn't agree with it. So there's a limit. In other words, there have to be things that are off limits as well as on limits for collective, collegial
behavior,
communal living.
Could be behavior living. But the bottom line is that activism, it can be a trigger point, the trigger point to a turning point. And I want to look at that concept of the historical turning point within the framework of climate change, because again, the book talks about it as a historical turning point. So what makes this moment so different to other previous crises, perhaps? And are you concerned that perhaps world leaders who reject climate change are potentially blinding us to a future danger which potentially undermines the sense of being part of this living entity of history, making change for the better?
Yes, it's the brief answer that those world leaders who are trying to obfuscate and deny are actually causing immense harm. But in fact, their electorates are going to tell them otherwise, tell them to get their fingers out. And there are signs of this in many, many countries around the world, including in some despotisms. There are still citizens groups that meet and protest and demand action. So this is on a par with I don't know, an ice age or something. There have been these big potential turning points in history before, and this is the reverse of an ice age. It's an overheating age. But it is, in retrospect, it'll be seen as a great turning point. And I do believe that humans, that we're usually very last minute about these things, but at the last minute we realise and pull our fingers out and act together.
But it takes me back when we look at the climate emergency to a point that was raised earlier in our conversation about humans being conditioned, if you like, to a sense of immediacy, that we can hit things, that we can hit a button on our computer, we can order something and it arrives in half an hour's time, or it arrives the following day. Now, my question to you is, the climate emergency itself, is it forcing us to think in longer timescales than we're used to? Because we're not talking about things which can happen in 2 days or 2 weeks. It could take 20 years, it could take 100 years, it could take 200 years, when most of us will not be around. So does that make it very difficult for people to perhaps really take the threat seriously? And really, are we intellectually equipped to think centuries ahead? Do we have that capacity?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but I think yes. And I think it's the mixture of being aware in the moment, but we also, as a species, we do think long. And this is just going to be an extreme example of this. And one of the reasons I think we'll pull our fingers out at the last moment is because that's when the long term and the here and now will coalesce, as it were. But things like the melting ice and the Arctic ice cap and the rising sea levels, that's going to have an impact really quite quickly, and maritime communities are not going to like it when London's not going to like it when the Thames is 20 feet higher. In fact, it can't continue. And also people are concerned for their children or their families, or the people in general. So I think, but again, it's quite difficult to do this, to create the sense of urgency without scaremongering, because we don't want people to be terrified.
Well, that's the problem, because if you scaremonger, you alienate.
Yes, exactly. So it's got to be done by informed reasoning. But I think it can be done, is being done, and I think the awareness of this is much, much greater than even 20 years ago. And I've seen things change like this because, for example, I have a food allergy, and not that long ago, 30 years ago, when I told people I couldn't eat bread, wheat flour, people would be scandalized or horrified. But there's been education about it and information. Now people take it as a matter of course. So people can take these things on board. And actually, when I was first diagnosed, I thought, oh, who cares? And then I suddenly thought, oh, well, do I want to die young after spending years lying on a chaise longue because I'm too unwell to stand? I suddenly thought, oh, right, yes, no, I can think ahead. I can go on the diet. So I think people can. And I think we're getting very near to a big turning point. There are world leaders urging this, and I think we're getting near.
Right. So you just taking that point, do you feel that perhaps it's that a new type of citizenship is emerging as a result of the climate conversation? And where are the closest comparisons we have in history from previous crises, which perhaps feed your optimism?
I think the best example I have for that is, in many countries, wartime solidarities. Even countries that have been quite divided, but say Russia, Mother Russia, the peasantry, who never really cared much for the lords and the government, but they rallied to save Mother Russia. There was something very, very visceral and instinctive. And I've just been writing something about the suffragette campaigns before World War One, and the campaigns among men for the full male franchise, and all of those issues were dropped in the First World War, and there was a tremendous national rally. In fact, a lot of, especially the young men, dying in the trenches. And I've been reading some of the speeches in Parliament when they came to the franchise, adaptation in 1918. And a number of the speakers saying, we've learnt that we're all fellow citizens, we're sharing this, and we're so impressed by what everybody's done, and we didn't think the masses, we thought women were flighty and negligible and the masses were rabble and all the rest, and so how impressed we are with our fellow citizens, and we can trust them and share government together. And they took them 2 goes to have the full female franchise, but first all men and then some sort of women and then all women within 10 years. So I think there are lots of examples of this, and I think wartime emergency, the danger is a great thing that is educative. As long as we perceive the danger in time.
Well, yes, I was about to say that, but that's a fair point that you raised. But look, we are 25 years into the 21st century, and it has been a tumultuous time, to say the least, because old orders are being challenged. We don't know what will arise in their place. So the world, to some people, is looking distinctly unfamiliar. But just projecting ahead, what do you think that future historians will say about this era? Do you think that they'll assess it as a moment of reckoning and one that we embraced, or perhaps one of renewal?
I certainly think it's going to be one of renewal, but I was smiling because if it is a tragic reckoning, there may not even be any historians ahead to assess. So, I mean, I do think it's a major crunch point for humanity. But as I said before, I think although we're last minute at it, we will rally at the last minute when the here and now and the long term, as it were, collide and come together.
But the thing is, you are an optimist. You've said that already. There are cynics who would say, well, there isn't that much to be optimistic about, quite frankly. So given the reality in which we currently exist, what is it that doesn't just give you a sense of hope, but sustains your belief in human resilience? In other words, it isn't going to be so badly eroded that people just give up, surrender to whatever is there.
Well, here I go back to my argument about the building of civic institutions over the last 300 to 50 years. And these are not just at an international level and governmental levels, but the non-governmental organizations as well. There's a whole network of things uniting the globe. And actually, there's also international trade, international communications, finance, all sorts of things. Actually, we are living in a unified web far more than we realize from day to day. And I mean, one other, just a small thing about unification, how interesting that one language is emerging as the lingua franca, as we used to say from the days when it used to be French, but English is emerging as the international language. And I was in a train the other day, eco-travelling, you'll be pleased to hear, coming back through France from Spain, and there was an altercation between a group of young men, Spanish young men, and a group of French young women over who had the right to which seats and whatever. And one of the girls jumped up on a chair and said, "Come on, do we all speak English? Let's sort this out." I was absolutely charmed. That was, there are far more international links than we think.
And was it resolved amicably?
Yes, it turned out that the girls had the right. This firm woman was the young girl, and in fact, Tony and I were in the wrong seat, so we immediately got up and moved as well to help the solution. But okay, yes, but it was a very interesting moment. She jumped up and said, "Do we all speak English?" And, so there was, and she was trying to appeal to some, sort of order, not just they were all sort of standing arguing.
Right, but the art of diplomacy always wins at the end of the day. But look, we have to leave it there because sadly we have run out of time. But Penelope J. Corfield, or Penny Corfield, thank you so much for joining me. And just a reminder that her book Time Space is published by Austin Macaulay Publishers. It's available online and of course in all good bookstores. I'm Juliette Foster and this is the European Magazine Interview.